our epoch is distinguishable by multipolarity and transformation. With that in mind, how would you assess the theoretical flexibility of nuclear deterrence as a stabilizing mechanism, and to what extent can its underlying assumptions be challenged by emerging paradigms?
So I have, of course, thought a lot about nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. And the problem with nuclear deterrence is that these weapon systems are hugely destructive. People are maybe not aware, but they're 1,000 times more destructive than the most powerful conventional weapons. And I'm talking just about the first generation atomic bombs, like the ones used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Later on, the H bombs became even 1,000 times more powerful, so 1,000,000 times more powerful than the most powerful conventional weapons of today. So, in my view, democratic nuclear armed states will not use nuclear weapons. And the problem is that the enemy knows that. And so, as a result, nuclear deterrence by these nuclear armed states becomes not credible. It's not credible and becomes hollow. For instance, Putin will not believe that Macron, the French president, will ever use nuclear weapons. And so that gives a lot of power in the hands of Putin. He's more motivated than Macron, for instance, in the war in Ukraine. And he may, in a more credible way, threaten to use and even use nuclear weapons. Also because it's not a democratic state.
Okay, so overall, you would say that the greatest problem that we face is actually the dichotomy between the idea of using these weapons between I'm going to use conventional Western states and the strategic enemy of those Western states, as you've stated, Putin, that being Russia.
Yeah, but even I'm making a difference in scale between democratic nuclear armed states and the others, but even for the others, the logic applies there as well. To what extent is it credible to believe that Russia will launch a huge attack on the United States, knowing that the United States will reply with nuclear weapons? I mean, and both countries and the rest of the world will be gone. I mean, if you think it through, there are a lot of problems with this reasoning.
Okay, thank you. Now on to our second question. From your standpoint, as an academic, as a professional, from your standpoint, how should we interpret current discussions around the concept of a Eurobomb or a collective European nuclear capacity? Is it a strategic evolution within the deterrence paradigm, a European symbolic gesture of autonomy, or a theoretical response to alliance dependency?
So you're right to bring up the idea of the Eurobomb, a nuclear weapon for Europe, for the EU, or a coalition of the willing of within the EU. This is not a new debate. One of my colleagues, Benoit Pilopidas from Paris, calls it a zombie debate. It comes up and it goes down and it goes up and it goes down. It's already came up in the 1990s, for instance, after the French nuclear weapons tests of Chirac, mid-1990s. Later on, again, when Trump came to power in 2016, after Macron gave a speech in 2020, and recently, there were two events that triggered that debate again. First of all, the war in Ukraine, war on European security, on European territory, and at the same time, coming of power of Trump II, the second Trump administration. And especially after the Oval Office incident between Trump and Zelensky in February of this year, people in Europe really got afraid. And also after the Vance speech in Munich, really came to believe that the NATO assurances did not apply anymore. And so the result of these two events was that in Europe, many political leaders and observers really started to take serious the idea of strategic autonomy, to take our own security and defense in our own hands in Europe, regardless of NATO and regardless of the Americans. And within this debate, of course, normally at the end of that debate should come up the question of nuclear weapons. Do we as Europeans then also need a nuclear deterrent? Question mark. And secondly, how? If so, how? Because nowadays there are French nuclear weapons in Europe and in the EU, and the British nuclear weapons outside the EU. And the French and the British that also to a certain extent cooperate already at the low level. So this idea is now becoming more central stage. With even the German Chancellor Merz, that's a precedent, it's the first time that happens, speaking out in favor of a kind of Europeanization of the French nuclear weapons. And the same applies to the Belgian Prime Minister, Bart de Wever, my own Prime Minister, speaking out in favor. And that's the first time that that's happening. So I think observers should take this debate seriously.
Mm-hmm. Continuing a little bit on this question, this isn't on my script, so I'm going completely off script on this one. But wouldn't Europeanizing French nuclear weapons or British nuclear weapons discredit the actual potential of these weapons? Because at the end of the day, Paris or London would still have the final veto, the final word. Wouldn't this, in some sense, kind of erode actually European credibility? That's the word.
But if you are trying to say that there's a problem with the smaller states depending on the French/British nuclear weapons, then you're basically saying that the idea of extended nuclear deterrence, a nuclear umbrella, that idea in general is problematic. Mm-hmm. And on that point, I agree. In the beginning, I already criticized the idea of nuclear deterrence as such, but extended nuclear deterrence is even more problematic. The idea is that one state with nuclear weapons promises to secure the interests of a state without nuclear weapons, even though the national interests of both states are different. And on the contrary, by responding with nuclear weapons, one could invite a nuclear retaliation against one's own capabilities and state that otherwise would never have happened. So, in my view, and I'm not the only one, extended nuclear deterrence is very problematic because it's not credible. And you can argue that certainly applied in the Cold War between the United States on the one hand and Europe on the other, with the United States having this nuclear umbrella over Europe, because there's a big distance between both continents, and America is safe and was safe and makes it unsafe by providing this nuclear umbrella to Europe. And you can make the argument, and that's what the advocates of Eurobomb do, that there's a difference with France and the UK doing the same because they're closer to the continent, the European continent. France is part of the continent, and so their national interests may overlap more with smaller states like Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, than was the case in the past with the United States. Now, a difference between the American nuclear umbrella and a potential French-British nuclear umbrella is, another difference is the following, that the American tactical nuclear weapons in Europe were substrategic nuclear weapons that were meant to be used on the battlefield, smaller ones in principle, while the French and the British do not have substrategic nuclear weapons for the moment. All their nuclear weapons are strategic, which makes it even harder to believe that they will use these strategic nuclear weapons for the defense of other European member states. So all in all, I think the idea of extended nuclear deterrence is highly problematic, and it also applies to the French and the British. By the way, the French never believed in the American nuclear umbrella. That's why they got nuclear weapons themselves. And now they want us, Belgians, Dutch, and Germans, and other Europeans to believe in the French nuclear umbrella. That's a bit ironic.
Completely. And I'm French, and I completely agree. Now, with the final question of my predisposed 3 questions, and I have the 2 others that I sent to you by email. With traditional arms control architectures under strain, what conceptual or institutional, I can't say that word, institutional, thank you so much, institutional innovations do you think sustain credible deterrence while it's been a long day, reinvigorating Europe's role in promoting strategic restraint and non-proliferation?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Of course, no worries. I'll try to do it without the bad words. With traditional arms control architectures under strain, what conceptual or institutional innovations do you think might sustain credible deterrence while reinvigorating Europe's role in promoting strategic restraint and non-proliferation?
That's a long question.
It is.
I think I'm a believer in institutions and in arms control. But what we see is nowadays that all the arms control treaties from the Cold War are gone, more or less. ABM Treaty, INF Treaty, ABM Treaty on missile defense, INF Treaty on the intermediate range nuclear forces in Europe, Open Skies Treaty on verification and transparency, CFE on conventional weapons. They're all gone. The CTBT is now in danger because the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, because Trump is threatening to start testing again. So the only bilateral arms control treaty left is New START, and that one expires in February of next year. So from February of next year onwards, we will live in a world without any bilateral or multilateral arms control treaty, except the nuclear weapon-free zone treaties, the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but which is also in crisis, and the newly established TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But the latter one is not very popular in the nuclear armed states and the allies. I think if you really chooses non-proliferation and disarmament, then Europe should take the idea of a nuclear weapon-free zone serious. But for the moment, that's a no-go. France and UK are not thinking about eliminating their nuclear weapons. So, as I said before, the trend is towards the other extreme. More and more non-nuclear weapon states are interested in nuclear weapons. Not only Poland or Ukraine, because Ukraine had nuclear weapons, they gave them up, and that was attacked by Russia. But also states like Germany, and the topic of today, the idea of a Eurobomb, is gaining popularity. So that will keep nuclear deterrence, but will be bad for arms control and non-proliferation, because if you Europeanize the French and British nuclear weapons, you give the bad signal to the rest of the world. You give the signal that nuclear weapons are good for security and stability. So what legitimacy do we still have then to ask Iran in a much more unstable environment not to go nuclear? That's not sustainable.
Yeah.
No, I think that there can be found a middle way, a middle road by getting rid of nuclear weapons, but keeping the idea of deterrence. Because states will always feel insecure and will need a kind of deterrent. But then the question is, which one is the most reliable, credible one? And then, as I said in the beginning, nuclear deterrence is not very credible, certainly not in the hands of democratically democratically elected political decision makers. But what is more credible are modern conventional weapons. Yeah. So the idea of conventional deterrence, I think, is as a replacement for nuclear deterrence, is I think a rather new and innovative idea. I've written a piece on that last year, and I argue that in turn, this alternative for nuclear weapons may give the nuclear armed states incentives to think seriously about getting rid of nuclear weapons in the longer term. We need to give them an alternative. Yeah, I think the assumption in your question is that NATO's assurances are still working. I'm not sure. I think NATO's nuclear posture and NATO's posture in general is becoming hollow because of the deteriorating political relations between, on the one hand, the United States and Europe on the other hand. And that is already going on for years. It started even before the Trump administration. Obama pivot to Asia, looking to Asia more than the Middle East and to Europe, because America is diminishing in power, is declining, relatively speaking, and has to make choices. We are not living in a unipolar world anymore. This is a multipolar world. And America is looking to other regions, more in particular to China, than to Europe. And while the Biden administration was still more or less interested in Europe triggered because of the war in Ukraine, with the arrival of the Trump administration, it is very clear that the United States is not interested anymore in Europe. It's not giving any weapons anymore to Ukraine. It's not providing money anymore. It wants us to expend much more on defense. We're going from 2 to 5% defense expenditures because it was asked by Trump. So he doesn't like the EU, Trump. He doesn't like NATO. In the first term, he wanted to quit NATO. So more and more observers of international politics in Europe believe that NATO is a hollow shell, and that the Americans will not help us when we are attacked. And of course, this is the crux of NATO, Article 5. So if there's no trust anymore in the Americans, then NATO it does not mean much anymore. And therefore also that means also that NATO's nuclear posture is even more becoming incredible than before. You understand? And these are all reasons, again, why the Europeans take the idea of strategic autonomy more serious. And while why we spend now more on defense, and why even the idea of a Eurobomb is back.